Welcome to today's event from the Oxford Interfaith Forum. My name is Delvin Case. I'm a senior fellow of the OIF, and I'm really excited to welcome you to today's event with Professor Robert Alter and Professor Karina Martin-Hogan. I am the executive director of Deus Ex Musica, which is an organization that promotes the use of music as a resource for biblical thinking and interpretation. So I'm especially interested in finding out about the literary perspectives that Professor Alter brings to his work and to the scriptures. It's my honor to introduce the host for today's event. It's Professor Karina Martin-Hogan. She's an associate professor in biblical studies and ancient Judaism and director of Fordham College's honors program at Fordham University. Her research focuses on ancient Judaism, especially its interaction with Greek and Roman culture in the Second Temple period. She teaches courses on the Hebrew Bible and its early Jewish and Christian interpreters.
Thank you, Delvin, and welcome everyone to this meeting of the reading group Sacred Literature in Interfaith Contexts. Our presenter today is Professor Robert Alter, speaking on literary form and meaning in the Hebrew Bible. Robert Alter is professor of the Graduate School and Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, and is past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics. He has twice been a Guggenheim Fellow. He's been a senior fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities, a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, an Old Dominion Fellow at Princeton University. He has written widely on the European novel from the 18th century to the present, on American fiction, and on modern Hebrew literature. He has also written extensively on literary aspects of the Bible. His 28 published books include 2 prize-winning volumes on biblical narrative and poetry, and award-winning translations of Genesis and of the 5 books of Moses. He has devoted book-length studies to Fielding, Stendhal, Nabokov, and the self-reflective tradition in the novel. Among his publications over the past 30 years are Necessary Angels, Tradition and Modernity in Kafka, Benjamin, and Scholem, 1991, Imagined Cities, 2005, Pen of Iron, American Prose and the King James Bible in 2010, and The Art of Biblical Translation in 2019, and Nabokov and the Real World in 2021. His completed translation of the Hebrew Bible with a commentary was published in 2018 in a 3-volume set. In 2009, he received the Robert Kirsch Award from the Los Angeles Times for a lifetime contribution to American letters. And in 2013, the Charles Homer Haskins Prize for Career Achievement from the American Council of Learned Societies. In 2019, the American Academy of Arts and Letters conferred on him an award for literature. He has been given honorary degrees by Yale, Northwestern, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and 3 other institutions. So now I'll hand it over to Professor Alter. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your introduction, Glenda. I want to begin with an enigma. It's really a puzzle that the ancient Hebrew writers produced what they did. And let me put this in perspective. When we say ancient Israel, it has a kind of grand resonance. Ancient Israel produced the Bible. In ancient Israel, King David founded a dynasty, unless you're a skeptic and say the whole thing is not historical. In ancient Israel, the first temple was built and so forth. In fact, the ancient Israel was a kind of backwards culture. If you simply look at a map of the ancient Near East, you see this little sliver of land sandwiched in between a series of great empires to the east, the Assyrian, the Persian, the Babylonian, and of course, another great empire to the south, Egypt. And if you glance at the archaeological record, you have to say that in terms of material culture, the ancient Israel was a rather rudimentary place. That is, what we have of visual art and sculpture of ancient Israel is not much more than line drawings. If you look at the architecture, there's nothing comparable to what you have in Egypt, the palaces and the pyramids and the ziggurats in Mesopotamia. So this is backwater. And for the enigma is that in this small backwater culture, literary works were produced of astonishing brilliance, works that I think eclipse everything around them, both in poetry and prose. Now, there's a difference, let's say, in background between the poetry and the narrative. The poetry definitely inherits what is sometimes called the Syro-Canaanite tradition. And we know this because of the writings in the city of Ugarit to the north, on the Syrian coast of the Mediterranean, which were discovered in the late 1920s and deciphered in the 1930s, written in a language that's closely cognate to biblical Hebrew, and that shows poetry that evinces the same prosodic system that you find in biblical poetry. So this is nothing that has been invented by the Hebrew writers. Although I would say that the subtlety and the complexity of biblical poetry far exceeds what you find in the Ugaritic writing. Now, the narrative is something different, because what one finds, and I've been pondering this for many years, is a whole set of narrative conventions that are innovations, that are inventions of the Hebrew writers. And they are very sophisticated inventions. I would say that when a culture invents something that's formally new in literature, it's a sign that it's vitally creative. For example, in the 14th century in Italy, Italian poets hit on this new form, the sonnet, in the way that they handled it. There was an octet and then a sestet, and then it became the range of Europe. People began to say, hey, that's a great way to express something in 14 lines of poetry. Now, maybe because there was a modest amount of interaction between Hebrew culture and let's say Akkadian culture or Egyptian culture, at least going in the direction from the Hebrew to the other culture. Unlike my example of the sonnet, there wasn't much influence, virtually no influence on what they invented, but the invention was quite remarkable. I'd like to walk you through one or two of those innovations. And let me say this, as somebody who's been working for many years on the literary aspects of the Hebrew Bible, we have suffered from a kind of cultural amnesia. That is, certain literary conventions which would have been native to the ancient culture and recognized by the audiences of the poems and the stories were forgotten. They were forgotten for an obvious reason, that Christians and Jews focused on the Bible as a revelation of theological truths, as a guide to the moral life and so forth. And the literary fashioning of these texts tended to recede into the background and then to be forgotten. So let me begin with the narrative prose, and I'd like to focus on one particular convention, which is near verbatim repetition. Now, we all know that we who read the Bible, and just reading the Bible in translation will suffice, that there's a lot of repetition in the narratives. I mean, verbal repetition, which is a little surprising because these narratives are famous for their economy, for their artistic economy. So what's all this about repetition? And by the way, if you read the Hebrew Bible only in translation, you only get maybe half or 2/3 of the repetitions, because the modern translators, not the King James people, the modern translators want to avoid repetition. They were told by their grade school teachers that when you write an essay, you don't repeat yourself, but you find different ways to saying most of the same thing. The Hebrew writers said the same thing in the same words with a certain difference. Okay, the difference runs something like this. You'll find this story where one character says something, or let's say first the narrator says something, and then a character says something in almost the same words, but with a slight difference, or sometimes a pronounced difference. And it could be in some instances that a second character will repeat the words of the first character, but also giving it a different spin from his or her point of view. So I'll begin with a kind of easy example from Genesis 39, the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. As you all recall, I'm sure, she has a yen for this beautiful young man, and day after day she's been saying to him, "Lie with me." I'm going to come to the climax of the story. And it happened on one such day that he came into the house to perform his tasks, and there was no man of the men of the house there in the house. By the way, that's a different kind of repetition, the sort of repetition that Buber and Rosenzweig identified in the 1920s of repeating a word because the word carries thematic freight, because it's what Buber and Rosenzweig called a Leitwort, a leading word, like a leitmotif. And both house and man are leading words in this story. And she seized him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went out. And so, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, okay, we have the same sequence of words with hardly any change, no significant change. Why do we have that? I think for two reasons. One is to hold us in suspense for a moment. Okay, she's tried to assault him sexually and he's escaped her. What's going to be her next move? So that's one reason, to create a little bit of suspense. The other reason is that the repetition here, almost an exact repetition, reviews the evidentiary data, which then are going to be distorted. So when she saw what she saw, she called out to the people of the house and said to them, saying, "See, he has brought us a Hebrew man to play with us." Okay, notice that she refers to her husband not as your master or my husband, but as he, which I think is a little contemptuous or a little angry. And the verb for to play, litzachek, has a range of meanings. It can mean mockery, it can mean laughter, it can mean sexual dalliance. And I think she's toying with the possibility of both sexual dalliance and mockery. He came into me, which is a little bit of a shocker, because to come into is also an idiom that indicates sexual intercourse, consummated sexual intercourse. He came into me to lie with me, and I called out in a loud voice. And so when he heard me raise my voice and call out, he left his garments by me and fled and went out. Now, you'll notice that the same sequence of phrases that has been repeated twice is repeated a third time, but she makes two significant shifts, giving away the fact that she's lying. One is that she makes the calling out precede his running away, and the cause of it, which was not in fact the case, and a very crucial change. He left his garment by me. Of course, what was said before twice was he left his garment in her hand. Now, in her hand means that she clutched the tunic and tore it off his back. By me changes the whole picture. It means that he removed his garment voluntarily as a preparation for rape. So everything turns in a way on one preposition, biyadi, in my hand, or biyada in her hand, and etzli, by me. And by the way, just an indication of the formal sophistication of this narrative, the word in the hand has been repeated several times earlier in the story, in the framing verses at the beginning. That is, everything that Potiphar had, he left in Joseph's hand. Now that's metaphorical in his hand, meaning in his trust. And it's a terrible idea, as the moderns do, to translate it as in his trust or under his supervision, because the subtle point of the story is that we have things being left in Joseph's hand, metaphorically, in his trust. And then at the climax of the story, we have the garment left in her hand, and now in the hand becomes literalized. Okay, let me go on with this for just a minute. He left his garment by me and fled and went out. And now she has said, and she's identified Joseph not by name, but as a Hebrew man, ish ivri. When she lays the garment by her until her husband comes home, and she spoke to him things of this sort, saying, now we have her lie repeated a second time. The Hebrew slave came into me, whom you brought us, to play with me. And so, when I raised my voice and called out, he left his garment by me and fled outside. So the same lying elements are repeated here. But look at another change, maybe slightly more subtle. How does she refer to Joseph when she's talking to the household staff? A Hebrew man, ish ivri. When she talks to her husband, she says, the Hebrew slave, eved ivri. Now, what's the difference? Well, why did she make this change, which might seem to be trivial? Changes are made in repetition in dialogue when you're addressing a different audience. When she's addressing the household staff, she calls Joseph a Hebrew man. She doesn't want to say Hebrew slave because they're slaves too. So she wants to avoid any suggestion of solidarity between the household people and Joseph. And therefore she labels him a Hebrew man, in a way maybe invoking a kind of ethnic prejudice. You know about all those wild Semites who come down from the north and endanger us, just as Donald Trump at one memorable moment intimated that most of the Mexicans that cross the border are rapists. It's that kind of thing. On the other hand, when she talks to her husband, she calls him a Hebrew slave because she wants to remind her husband that his slave, a person who it was basically his property, had the audacity to try to assault her. So I've put my finger on a number of things going in just these few lines. And you can see how repetition is not clumsy repetition, but it needs to be honored and paid attention to because it's actually a very subtle instrument of literary expression. As words are repeated, the small changes are apertures of meaning, which open up and give another dimension to the story. Now, I want to just take one more example of repetition, slightly different, but it's basically reflects the same convention. After the death of Saul, there is a fierce civil war between the northern tribes who are allied with Saul and commanded by Abner, Saul's general, and the southern tribes, there are only two of them, that are allied with David and commanded by his general, Joab. Finally, Abner gets totally fed up with Saul's heir and decides to parley with David and see if he can arrange a treaty, a peace treaty, and bring the 10 northern tribes over to David, which of course would be preeminently in David's to David's advantage. So here is how it reads, and I have to say that the repetitions which you hear do not appear in the modern translations that I've looked at. And I was shocked when I saw this, because I thought the translator essentially are erasing an important literary effect. And Abner sent messages to David saying, "To whom should the land belong? Make a pact with me, and look, my hand will be with you to bring round to you all Israel," meaning the northern tribes. And he said, David said, "Good, I shall make a pact with you." But I'm sorry, I want to skip down to their actual meeting. And Abner came to David in Hebron, and with him were 20 men. Of course, he's a commander-in-chief of the army, and he travels with a military retinue, but this retinue doesn't threaten any violence. And David made a feast for Abner and for the men who were with him. Of course, an amicable gesture. And Abner said to David, "Let me rise and go and gather to my lord the king all Israel, that they may make a pact with you, and you shall reign over all your heart desires," as you would become king of the entire people of Israel, not just the two southern tribes. And David sent Abner off, and he went in peace. Vayelech b'shalom. Now, I should say that the word peace does have, the word shalom does have a number of allied meanings in biblical Hebrew, and you will find that modern translators rendered here, and he went off unharmed, he went off safe, and so forth. This seems to me obtuse, because what is at stake is precisely a peace treaty, and peace is being emphasized. And look, David's servants and Joab had come from a raid, an abundant booty they brought with him. And Abner went out with David in Hebron, for he had sent him off, and he went in peace. Okay, now we have a second time. He sent him off and went in peace. Vayishalchehu vayelech b'shalom. And Joab and all the force that was with him had come. And they told Joab, saying, "Abner, son of Ner, has come to the king, and he sent him off, and he went in peace." Third time that crucial clause is repeated. Now, a naive modern writer might say, "Well, that's boring, why doesn't the writer vary it?" But the repetition, as we'll see in just a moment, is extremely significant because, it's going to be varied. And again, the repetition is erased in the modern versions. And Joab came to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner has come to you. Why did you send him off?" And he went, going off. As the Hebrew now is vayelech haloch, with the infinitive after the conjugated verb. So only one word has been changed. The word b'shalom, in peace, has vanished, and instead we have, and he went going off. This is a beautiful piece of foreshadowing of what will happen next in the narrative. Because peace is no longer here. Peace is the last thing that Joab has on his mind. And the verb to go, at a couple of places in the Hebrew Bible, actually is a euphemism for dying. And that's precisely what Joab is thinking of. That is, Job has two reasons for wanting to eliminate Abner. One, the primary one, is a vendetta. That is, Abner has killed the brother of Joab on the battlefield, Asael, and he wants to exact vengeance according to the vendetta code. The stark Hebrew phrase is to redeem the blood, to redeem the blood of his brother. The other reason, you might say, is to protect his professional position, because he's quite aware that Abner is his counterpart among the northern forces. He's a skilled, experienced battlefield commander, and if the peace treaty is consummated, it could be that David will decide to replace him with Abner. So what he does is he rushes after the departing Abner, greets him from the roadside, and stabs him in the belly, accomplishing what he had in mind from the moment he heard this news about Abner's coming to sign a pact with David. So you see, the change of a single word brings into, I would say, ominous focus the whole point of the story. And if you don't see this, you're missing much of the whole point of the story. Now, let me say something. I don't want to entirely neglect poetry. As I said, the poetic system is inherited from the Canaanites. And the system works this way. Most lines of poetry have two halves, and the two halves usually have the same number of accented syllables, the same number of beats. There's some variation there, but usually they do. And they seem to be parallel in meaning. And for a long time, it was said that that's how the system works. It says the same thing with synonyms. So you have a semantic parallel, which is it's a kind of approximate equivalent of the phonetic parallel in English poetry of rhyme. That is, my rule of thumb is that all systems of poetry are mnemonic. They're memory machines. And the formal devices reinforce the memory. That is, if you read "Behold" at the end of the first line of a Shakespeare sonnet, then you're going to remember that "cold" is going to come in the rhyming line. And the equivalent of rhyme would be a rhyming of meaning. Now, that is approximately right, but I would like to modify that. Unlike the Ugaritic poems, where this seems to be quite true, the Hebrew poets developed a system to make it more expressive, I would say more forceful. So let me go to, I guess, what is the second poem in the Hebrew Bible, in the early Genesis, where a figure named Lamech in the Hebrew, who about whom we know nothing except the poem that he speaks here. speaks to his two wives in poetry, and it's a kind of victory chant. And the first line goes like this, and when you will see where parallelism is very strict. It's Ada and Sila, hear my voice. O wives of Lamech, give ear to my utterance. So you see, every single term is exactly parallel. That is, you have Ada and Sila, and then wives of Lamech. You have listen, you have give ear, you have voice, you have utterance. And also what's rather typical, which makes sense when you're reaching for synonyms, is that the more unusual word appears in the second half of the line. That is, you have the ordinary word for listen, lishmoa, in the first half. In the second half, you have la'azin, to give ear. You have voice in the first half, you have utterance in the second half. Okay, so the system seems to be pat. But let's look at the third line of this short poem. He said that he's killed maybe two different people, a man and a young man or a boy. And then at the end of the poem, he says, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, Lamech 7 and 70. Now, you would think that if the system were based strictly on parallel meanings, on semantic equivalence, that when numbers appear, you would have 2 in the first half and a pair in the second half, which you can say in Biblical Hebrew, or what you cannot say in Biblical Hebrew is you would have 6 in the first half and half a dozen in the second half. But in fact, that never happens. Every time you have a number, you have to go up in the second half of the line. So here is a parade example from late Deuteronomy, from what Jews call Shirat HaAzinu, the long poem that begins with the words Hazinu, sometimes called the Song of Moses in English. How can one pursue 1,000 and 2 give 10,000 the chase? Okay, pursue, give the chase, that's sort of obvious synonymity. But then what happens to the numbers? From 1, you go to 2. From 1,000, you go to 10,000. And that is the way predominantly, not in every line, but predominantly the system works. As you go from part 1 to part 2 of the line, things go up in register, they intensify, they heighten. Sometimes they exhibit a kind of miniature narrative development. Now, I say all this simply to illustrate a general principle of literary fashioning in the Bible, that a system that could be quite mechanical, you say Adan, Sulan, and you say wives of Lamech, you say hear, and then you say give ear, which is, it works, but it's a bit of a bore. It's made into something dynamic. That is, things begin to happen in the second half of the line that were not happening in the first half even though there may be an overlap of meaning. So what I would propose in summary for your consideration, and as I say, depending on, if you're reading the Hebrew Bible in translation, it depends on which translation you're following. What happens is that the force of the story, the power of the poem, depends on things changing as they seem to be repeated. In fact, I would say an underlying rule of both poetry and prose in the Hebrew Bible is that there's lots of repetition, but with the repetition, there is change. And you have to look at the change in the repetition. And when you do, I think you'll find that literary expression in the Bible is more dynamic, more complicated, more subtle than our general preconceptions of it. And this is, all right, we all know that the Bible is a book or a collection of books, actually, with a religious purpose, even though the very term religion doesn't quite sit comfortably with the kind of culture that ancient Israel is. So the subtle and highly sophisticated literary articulation of the religious vision in the stories and in the poems complicates the meaning, leads us to see that the meaning is often more multifaceted and even profounder than we originally thought. Okay, I think I will hold my peace here to leave time for your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Alter, for such a fascinating discussion of repetition in its various forms in Hebrew literature. I'd like to encourage folks to use their hand raise icon under reactions in the bottom bar if you want to ask a question. I will just kick it off with one question that came to me as you were speaking. So you were talking about how parallelism in poetry is a mnemonic, as is rhyme. And I was wondering about the repetition in narrative, if it's mnemonic in the sense is it a feature of oral storytelling to use this pattern of repetition with slight variation? Like, do we see that in other kinds of storytelling in the ancient world?
Well, that's a good question. Now, I think that the mnemonic function is less central in the narratives because narratives don't expect to be remembered word for word, as in ancient cultures, I think poetry was. And I always think of this amazing moment in the story of Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian poet who died in the Gulag. At a certain point in the 1930s, he could not restrain himself. He wasn't publishing anymore. So with a small circle of friends, he recited by heart a poem pillaring Stalin as a mass murderer. A day or two later, he got the knock on the door in the middle of the night and was taken off by the NKVD to the notorious Lubyanka prison, where he was interrogated. And in the interrogation, his examiner had an integral text of the poem he had recited by heart, where there was nothing written. So that meant that the informer registered the whole poem and retained it as he listened to it. It's not a long poem, it's maybe 15 lines. So that's sort of testimony to the mnemonic function of poetry in more traditional societies. But what I would say about, I haven't really answered Professor Everson's question entirely. There are local mnemonic effects intended in the repetition and the narrative. That is, when we read the story of Potiphar's wife, or actually in the ancient world, when we listen to the story being recited to us, we can retain for a short space the repetition of he left his garment in her hand and he fled outside, and then we can see how it's distorted. So it's mnemonic on a smaller scale, I would say, than the poetry.
Thank you. We're about at time, so I'm going to hand it back over to Delvin Case.
Thank you very much, Professor Alter, and everyone who joined us today. Thank you, Professor Hogan. Our next event will be January 26th. It's going to be Professor Laurent Mignon from University of Oxford talking about presenting a talk entitled "From the People of the Book to the Books of the People: Christian Literature and the 19th Century Ottoman Turkish Literary World." So visit the website to find out more information about that and to register. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and it was nice to see a few familiar faces on the screen.
Thank you again, Professor Alter, for a wonderful presentation.